Imagine a city where every breath could be your last, where the ground beneath your feet is soaked with blood, where buildings stand like broken teeth against a burning sky, where winter cold kills as efficiently as bullets, where 2 million human beings will fight, suffer, and die over just a few square miles of frozen hell. This place exists. Its name is Stalin. The year is 1942. The world is burning in the flames of war. Nazi Germany has conquered an empire stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the gates of Moscow. The swastika flies over Paris, Warsaw, and Athens. Millions live under the boot of Hitler's tyranny. But deep within the Soviet Union, on the banks of the Volga River, one city will become the turning point of it all. A city that bears the name of the Soviet dictator himself, Stalingrad. Here, two titans will collide. Two ideologies, two armies, two men who will sacrifice everything for victory. Adolf Hitler, determined to break the Soviet Union and claim its riches. Joseph Stalin, willing to drown his enemies in Russian blood rather than surrender an inch. What follows will be the most brutal, savage, and costly battle in the history of human warfare. A battle where soldiers fight room to room, floor to floor, sometimes separated by nothing but a single wall, where snipers hunt their prey through the ruins like wolves, where men freeze to death in their trenches, clutching photographs of families they'll never see again. This is the story of Stalingrad, where the fate of World War II, and perhaps the world itself, hung in the balance, and where hell itself came to earth in the winter of 1942. To understand Stalingrad, we must first understand how the war reached this point. After conquering most of Europe, Adolf Hitler set his eyes on the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, crashed across the Soviet. His goal, not just victory, but annihilation. Hitler believed the Soviet Union was weak, its people inferior, its armies incompetent. He told his generals that the campaign would be over in 3 months. "We have only to kick in the door," he said, "and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." At first, it seemed he was right. The German advance was devastating. Soviet armies were surrounded and destroyed. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in the first months. Cities fell like dominoes: Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev. By December 1941, German forces were at the gates of Moscow. Victory seemed within reach. But then winter came. The coldest winter in decades. Temperatures plunged to -40 degrees Celsius. German soldiers, equipped for a summer campaign, froze in their inadequate uniform. Tanks wouldn't start, weapons jammed, supply lines stretched to breaking point, and the Soviets, masters of winter warfare, counterattacked. Moscow was saved. The Blitzkrieg had failed, but Hitler was not finished. In the summer of 1942, he launched a new offensive, Case Blue, aimed at the oil fields of the Caucasus. Without Soviet oil, the Red Army's tanks would be useless. Germany would have the fuel it desperately needed, and standing in the way was a city on the Volga River. Operation Barbarossa had already pushed deep into Soviet territory, but one city stood in his way, the industrial heart of the South. Named after his greatest enemy, Joseph Stalin, Stalingrad was a major industrial center. Its factories produced tanks, artillery, and munitions. Its location on the Volga River made it a vital transportation hub. Supplies from the south flowed through Stalingrad to the rest of the Soviet. But more than that, it bore Stalin's name. For Hitler, capturing Stalingrad would be a propaganda victory of immense value. For Stalin, losing the city named after him would be an unbearable humiliation. Hitler wanted to take it at any cost. Stalin ordered, "Not one step back." On July 28, 1942, Stalin issued Order No. 227, the infamous "Not One Step Back" order. It declared that any soldier who retreated without orders would be considered a traitor. Officers who allowed retreat would be arrested. Blocking detachments units positioned behind the front lines were authorized to shoot anyone who fled. It was brutal. It was ruthless. But Stalin believed it was necessary. The defense of Stalingrad would not just be a military operation. It would be a test of will, a battle where neither side could afford to lose. The defense of Stalingrad would not just be a military operation. It would be a test of will, a battle where neither side could afford to lose. The assault began in August 1942. On August 23rd, the German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. That same day, the Luftwaffe launched one of the most devastating aerial bombardments of the war. Wave after wave of Luftwaffe bombers turned Stalingrad into rubble. Over 1,000 aircraft filled the skies. Heinkel and Junkers bombers dropped tons of high-explosive and incendiary bombs. The goal was not just to destroy military targets, it was to terrorize, to break the will of the defenders. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed in the first days alone. Entire neighborhoods vanished in flames. The Volga River itself seemed to burn as oil storage tanks exploded, spreading fire across the water. Men, women, and children ran through the streets, desperately seeking shelter. Families were torn apart. Bodies lay everywhere in the rubble, in the streets, floating in the river. Stalingrad, once a thriving city of 400,000 people, became a landscape of destruction. But the Soviets did not surrender. They hid among the ruins, turning every building, every street, every basement into a fortress. The commander of the Soviet defense was General Vasily Chuikov, a tough, uncompromising officer who understood urban warfare. Chuikov's strategy was simple but brutal: hug the enemy. He ordered his troops to fight as close to the Germans as possible, so close that the Luftwaffe couldn't bomb without hitting their own men, so close that artillery was useless, so close that the battle became personal, intimate, and savage. "We will make them fight for every brick," Chuikov said. "Every brick will cost them blood." It was a new kind of warfare, brutal, personal, and unrelenting. The soldiers called it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. Men fought for every floor of a building, sometimes separated by just a wall. Imagine fighting in a bombed-out apartment building. The Germans hold the second floor, you hold the third. At night, you can hear them talking, breathing, moving. You throw grenades down the stairwell, they throw them back up. You dig tunnels through walls to surprise them. They do the same. Combat happens at arm's length. Knives, entrenching tools, bare hands. There are no front lines, no safe areas. The enemy could be anywhere above you, below you, behind the next wall. The fighting was so close that Soviet artillery would sometimes shell buildings while their own troops were still inside, just to kill the Germans occupying other floors. Snipers like Vasily Zaitsev became legends, turning the shattered city into a graveyard for German soldiers. Vasily Zaitsev was a shepherd from the Ural Mountains. Before the war, he hunted wolves. In Stalingrad, he hunted Germans. Zaitsev used the ruins to his advantage, hiding in rubble, moving silently through collapsed buildings, taking single, precise shots. He would wait for hours, perfectly still, until the perfect moment, then one shot, one kill. The Germans sent their own master sniper, Major Erwin König, to hunt Zaitsev. The duel between them became legendary, though historians still debate whether König actually existed or was Soviet propaganda. But the legend didn't matter. What mattered was that Zaitsev and snipers like him killed hundreds of German soldiers, demoralizing the enemy and inspiring Soviet defenders. Zaitsev trained other snipers, passing on his skills. His students killed hundreds more. The Germans began to fear the ruins, knowing that death could come from any shadow. Key locations became famous or infamous during the battle. Pavlov's house, a 4-story apartment building defended by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and a handful of men. They held it for 58 days against constant German attacks. It became a symbol of Soviet resistance. The grain elevator, a massive concrete structure that changed hands multiple times in brutal close-quarters fighting. Mamayev Kurgan, a hill overlooking the city, nicknamed Hill 102. It was the highest point in Stalingrad, and whoever controlled it, controlled the city. It changed hands 8 times. After the battle, soldiers found an average of 1,200 shell fragments per square meter of earth. The Red October factory, a steel plant where workers and soldiers fought side by side. Tanks rolled off the assembly line and drove straight into combat, sometimes without paint, their crews workers who had just built them. Then came the winter, the cruelest ally of the Soviet Union. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. The Volga River began to freeze. Supply lines became even more difficult. Food and ammunition ran short on both sides. German troops, low on food, ammunition, and hope, froze in their trenches. The Wehrmacht was not prepared for another Russian winter. Soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever they could find: newspapers, rags, even paper. Frostbite claimed thousands. Men huddled together for warmth. Some froze to death standing up. Horses died by the thousands. Soldiers ate them. When the horses were gone, they ate rats, stray dogs, anything. The Luftwaffe struggled to resupply the troops. Soviet anti-aircraft fire made every flight dangerous. Weather grounded planes for days at a time. And yet, Hitler refused to allow a retreat. He demanded that Stalingrad be taken, no matter the cost. By November, the German Sixth Army controlled most of the city, about 90% of it. The Soviets clung to a narrow strip of land along the Volga, sometimes only a few hundred meters deep. Victory seemed close for the Germans. Just one more push, they thought, and the city would fall. But they didn't know what was coming. And then, in November 1942, the Soviets struck back. While the Germans focused on the ruins of Stalingrad, the Soviets were planning something far bigger. Operation Uranus, a massive Soviet counterattack, encircled the entire German Sixth Army inside Stalingrad. On November 19, 1942, over 1 million Soviet soldiers launched a coordinated assault from the north and south of Stalingrad. The plan was brilliant. The German flanks were held by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies allies, who were poorly equipped and less motivated than the Germans. The Soviets targeted these weak points. Soviet tanks smashed through the Romanian lines like a hammer through glass. Within days, the two Soviet pincers met at Kalach, a town west of Stalingrad. 300,000 German soldiers were trapped. The entire Sixth Army, one of Germany's most powerful formations, was now surrounded, cut off, isolated. Paulus, the German commander, requested permission to break out. His officers begged him to retreat while there was still time. But Hitler ordered them to hold their ground, promising supplies from the air, but the Luftwaffe couldn't deliver. Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, had boasted that his aircraft could supply the trapped army. He promised to deliver 500 tons of supplies per day, the minimum needed to keep the Sixth Army alive. It was a lie or a delusion. The Luftwaffe could barely deliver 100 tons on the best days. Most days, it was far less. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns tore apart the transport planes. German soldiers watched as their supply planes were shot down in flames, their desperately needed food and ammunition burning before their eyes. The trap had closed. For months, the trapped Germans starved and froze, surrounded by relentless Soviet fire. Rations were cut again and again. Soldiers received 100 grams of bread per day, a few bites, then 50 grams, then nothing. They boiled leather boots to make soup. They scraped frozen meat from dead horses. They ate glue, sawdust, anything. Diseases spread: typhus, dysentery, trench foot. Medical supplies ran out. Morphine ran out. Bandages ran out. Wounded men lay in freezing cellars, screaming for help that never came. Men lost the will to live. They stopped shaving, stopped talking, stopped moving. They just sat in the cold, waiting to die. Meanwhile, the Soviets tightened the noose. Day by day, the pocket shrank. Soviet artillery pounded the Germans relentlessly. The perimeter collapsed inward. Airfields were lost, making resupply even harder. By January 1943, the situation was hopeless. Paulus sent desperate messages to Hitler, begging for permission to surrender. Hitler refused. He promoted Paulus to field marshal, a cynical gesture, since no German field marshal had ever surrendered. The message was clear: fight to the death. But by now, the Sixth Army was a ghost of itself. Skeletal soldiers stumbled through the ruins, too weak to fight. Ammunition was gone. Morale was shattered. By February 1943, it was over. On January 31st, Paulus surrendered the southern pocket. On February 2nd, the northern pocket surrendered as well. The mighty German Sixth Army was annihilated. Out of 300,000 men, fewer than 90,000 surrendered, and only 5,000 ever made it home again. The rest had died killed in combat, frozen, starved, or succumbed to disease. Those who surrendered faced a grim fate. They were marched into Soviet captivity, exhausted, frostbitten, and sick. Many died on the march. Others died in POW camps from disease, malnutrition, and harsh conditions. The few thousand who eventually returned to Germany in the 1,950 seconds were broken men, haunted by what they had endured. The Battle of Stalingrad cost over 2 million lives, soldiers and civilians alike. It was the bloodiest battle in human history. The exact numbers are staggering and almost incomprehensible. Approximately 500,000 German and Axis soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. Over 1.1 million Soviet soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. Tens of thousands of Soviet civilians dead. The city itself was obliterated. Of Stalingrad's 400,000 residents, only about 1,500 remained when the battle ended. The rest had fled, been killed, or evacuated. Not a single building in the city center remained intact. Stalingrad was, quite literally, a city of ruins. But it was also the turning point of World War II. From that day on, the tide of war began to turn, and Hitler's dream of conquest began to die in the snows of Stalingrad. Strategically, militarily, and psychologically, Stalingrad changed everything. Germany lost an entire field army, its finest troops, its best equipment. The loss could never be replaced. From this point on, Germany was on the defensive. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. If the Wehrmacht could be defeated at Stalingrad, it could be defeated anywhere. The Soviet Union, bloodied but unbroken, began its long march westward. Over the next 2 years, the Red Army would push the Germans back across Eastern Europe, all the way to Berlin. For Hitler, Stalingrad was a disaster of his own making. His refusal to allow retreat, his obsession with holding ground at all costs, had doomed an entire army. For Stalin, it was vindication. His order, not one step back, had been costly, but it had worked. The city bearing his name had held. The world took notice. In Britain and America, the victory at Stalingrad was celebrated. It proved that the Soviet Union could fight, that the Axis could be beaten. It paved the way for greater Allied cooperation. But the cost was almost beyond comprehension. Stalingrad was not just a victory. It was a statement that even in the darkest winter, courage, sacrifice, and the will to survive can change the course of history. The soldiers who fought at Stalingrad, German and Soviet alike, experienced horrors that defy description. They fought in conditions that no human being should ever have to endure. And yet, they fought. The Soviet defenders fought for their homeland, for their families, for survival. They fought because surrender meant death or slavery. The German soldiers fought because they were ordered to, because they believed in their cause, or simply because they had no choice. But in the end, both sides paid a terrible price. After the battle, Soviet workers began the long process of rebuilding. Stalingrad, renamed Volgograd in 1961, rose from the ashes. Today, the city stands as a monument to sacrifice. The Mamayev-Kurgan Memorial, crowned by the towering statue The Motherland Calls, honors the defenders. Every year, on the anniversary of the battle's end, Russians gather to remember, to honor, to ensure that the sacrifice is never forgotten. Stalingrad reminds us of the cost of war, of the resilience of the human spirit, and of the terrible price paid when ideologies collide and leaders refuse to yield. In the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, two empires clashed, and one began its long fall into darkness. The soldiers who fought there didn't know they were fighting at the turning point of history. They only knew cold, fear, and the instinct to survive. But their sacrifice, Soviet and German alike, changed the world. Stalingrad was not just a battle. It was the moment when the tide turned, when the seemingly unstoppable was stopped, when the myth died and reality set in. And when the world learned that no matter how powerful an empire may seem, it can be brought to its knees in the frozen hell of a single city. This was Stalingrad, the bloodiest battle in human history, and the beginning of the end for the Third Reich.